It's an honour to speak in on this piece of legislation, a piece of legislation that has been supported by every member of the Select Committee, I have to say, and I will acknowledge and applaud the chairmanship of Shane Ardern, who, as he said, is himself a farmer, a shareholder in Fonterra, who he disclosed that up front, and he's done a really good job. Mr Speaker, what is so important about this piece of legislation is that we are dealing with New Zealand's single biggest industry. The dairy industry produces 25% of our exports, Mr Speaker. That is not something that this House should trifle with. And so any change that comes before Parliament, any consideration of the dairy industry should be considered very, very carefully, Mr Speaker. Fonterra also is our only truly multinational company owned by New Zealanders. All the rest of them got large shareholdings offshore, or they're bailed out completely. This is one multinational owned by New Zealanders for New Zealand, producing 25% of our exports. Mr Speaker, it is so successful that it controls almost 40% of international tradable products in the dairy industry across the world. That makes it a considerable player in the world of food exports across the globe. It has huge potential, and it's something that we must realise if this country is to go forward, Mr Speaker. Nokia is to Finland as the Fonterra is to New Zealand, Mr Speaker, and we must keep it that way. So this piece of legislation deals with only at most 5% of the milk produced in this country. However, it's a 5% block of milk that is either sold at higher value through domestic consumption or goes into many value-added products. And at the time of its formation in 2001, and I think Fonterra and its managers and officials should be reminded that they are not the success story. In fact, they have built off the success of the Dairy Board and its predecessors in the dairy companies. There are many senior executives who think that they themselves have created this amazing company. They should be reminded on a regular basis that it has been built through the good work, the investment and the wisdom of New Zealand dairy farmers, and they have an obligation to ensure that it stays in the hands of New Zealand farmers as well. Mr Speaker, the 5% that we're dealing with, I think there have been a number of speakers talk about what we are doing here. We're effectively setting up an auction system for the up to 5% of milk that was addressed through the original formation of Fonterra to ensure that we had competition on the local market, that dairy farmers were able to enter and exit Fonterra. The monopoly position that the Dairy Board was in, effectively the monopoly buyer of milk from farmers and the monopoly exporter and seller of milk products, that to bring some balance and to ensure that there wasn't abuse of that monopoly power, that we had some competition in the domestic market so consumers in New Zealand could have fair prices for dairy products, and that farmers weren't locked in to an organisation that might not pay them a fair price for their milk, Mr Speaker. So it has been quite a process, and this piece of legislation is an evolution of that domestic supply situation. I have to say it's a bit late in coming to the House. The National Government, for all its rhetoric in saying it supports farmers, has mucked around on this issue, to use a rural term. Mucked around, and Mr Ardern knows that. Because the Minister, David Carter, came and couldn't quite grasp the problem. The previous Minister, Jim Anderton, had done a lot of good work, had got to the point and realised and recommended that an auction system be put in place, and that it should have been in place for this season. But the Minister came in, hesitated, procrastinated, did a U-turn, as the National Government's done in a whole lot of areas, and decided that we couldn't get it in place for this season, so we'll bring in a new pricing structure. A year and a half. Well, that's a short time for the National Party to procrastinate, a year and a half, believe me. And then they'll do about 2 or 3 U-turns in that time. Anyway, thankfully we've got back to, I think, a sensible situation here, which is why the Select Committee and all its members have supported this going forward. Mr Speaker, in passing this legislation, I think it's important to, in the second reading speech, to mention that the likelihood, in fact, the strong possibility that we'll have other legislation in this House dealing with Fonterra in the near future. And there has been much talk, and in fact Fonterra has just announced it's about to start discussion with farmers on a capital restructure. And a lot of farmers are not quite sure what this means, Mr Speaker. They have been told, and there are many people running around the country saying that Fonterra needs more money to grow the business. And that's true. They've done very well so far, I have to say, the Dairy Board and Fonterra. In fact, I don't think there's an industry that has grown so steadily, so sustainably and so profitably as the dairy industry has. And do you know how they've done it? Caution, retained earnings, smart investments, and not allowed their debt to get out of control. I have to say that the new management of Fonterra has allowed the debt to slip out beyond the level that is comfortable. They should have retained the earnings in the year that they paid record money to the farmers. They should have retained $1 billion of that money on their balance sheet, and they wouldn't have had an issue. But, Mr Speaker, they chose not to, and I don't think they deserved a bonus that year. But anyway, that's by the by. We've moved on, Mr Speaker. We are likely to have legislation in this House supporting possibly a capital restructure if the farmers deem that this is necessary. Well, before we agree, that's we, this House, agrees to any change, we should look very carefully at Fonterra, its success and its importance for New Zealand and in the international tradable market for dairy products. In fact, there has recently been a report, Mr Speaker, from Desiree Reid, who is a Nuffield scholar, one of the smartest, brightest leaders in the dairy industry, who's currently in Ireland and in Europe looking at the dairy industry. She reports back and has visited Irish farmers who are working hard to replicate our low-cost pasture-based advantage and using our crossbred genetics and all our wisdom to try and catch up. But what they have said is that Fonterra is the jewel in the crown of our dairy industry. So there are proposals to recapitalise Fonterra because there are claims that it doesn't have enough money to grow. Well, I'm not quite so sure about that. The question is, why would people be doing it if that is not the case? Well, there may be some people who think, for philosophical reasons, through blind ideology or whatever, that we just need to get some outside capital into Fonterra. Well, Mr Speaker, I say to this House, and I think the dairy industry should say to this House, don't mess with us, don't mess with success, Mr Speaker. And if Mark Weldon or John Key or others think that there is a need to bring in outside capital, outside control and ultimately outside ownership into Fonterra, then they should be warned, and I think the farmers will dig in for a big fight. Mr Speaker, I can't help but mention a situation that the Prime Minister finds himself in. He's in fact a big investor in a company called Dairy Investment Fund, which is a private equity investor focused on deregulating the dairy industry, Mr Speaker, to quote the Herald of 2008. I'm not sure what the current situation is with the Prime Minister, but he should disclose in this House before we do anything else to the dairy industry, before we pass any further legislation. In fact, even before this is passed, he should disclose whether he is still a major investor in the Dairy Investment Fund. Because there are vultures waiting out there, Mr Speaker, to take control, whether they be Chinese, whether they be New Zealanders, or any other people around the world, Mr Speaker. But if control of Fonterra is taken from the dairy farmers in this country, we will see that control slip offshore. This is our multinational company. It is the most successful industry in this country, Mr Speaker, and it is very important that this piece of legislation that we're passing, dealing with only 5% of the milk, It's important that this legislation is sound, and I believe it is. That's why Labour is supporting it, and that any other piece of legislation we bring to the House
I regret to advise
is
the
sound
member
also.
that his time has expired.